right? Well, if you got a Bible with you, got the Bible app on your phone, Revelation chapter 2 is where we'll be this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you, or maybe you're new to the Bible, not really sure how to find that, don't worry, we'll have all the verses here on the screens, and you can just follow along with us there. But while you are finding that, a couple of quick kind of housekeeping announcement things. First of all, if you have not met Ryan, who is up here leading us in worship yet, he is our intern who's going to be here helping lead us in worship through the summer. So if you haven't had a chance to meet him, make sure you go say hello after the service. Welcome him to the family. And then secondly, don't forget that this coming Wednesday night is our monthly prayer service. Remember, that's the last Wednesday of every month. So that's going to be this coming Wednesday right here in this room at 6 o'clock. And let me remind those of you who are part of the family, when we come together monthly to pray, this is not a time for us just to, pray for all these little odds and ends prayer requests. There's a time and a place for that, and that is absolutely necessary. But when we gather together the last Wednesday of every month to pray as a church family, this is a time to pray that God would use us as Garden Oaks Baptist Church to accomplish His mission here in this community. That God would use us to bring people who are far from Him into His family. And let me remind you that as God does that, for God to use us to move powerfully in this community, it's not going to be because we're so smart or creative or good or anything like that. If God is going to use us, it's going to be because He chooses to pour out His Spirit upon us. So that's why we come together to pray as a church family. So again, as we've said before, if you are part of the Garden Oaks family, you need to be there at the prayer service. All right, we can't do this, but if we could do this, I would almost say that it's mandatory if you're a member to be here at this service. It is the most important thing that we do as a church family when we come and pray together that God would powerfully use us. So don't miss that Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Now, let me ask you a question. What is something that you are afraid of? All right, for me, one of my biggest fears is snakes. Okay, I hate snakes. I can't even see a snake on TV without it freaking me out. Let me see if any of you are with me on this. The only good snake is a dead snake. Amen. Now, I know some of you, especially if you grew up in the country, some of you are like, no. Snakes are good. They'll eat mice and they'll keep the rodents away. Listen, give me mice any day over snakes. I'll take all the rodents if the snakes stay away. I hate snakes. I cannot do snakes. So back when I was in college, I was living in this kind of rundown, dingy little duplex with a buddy of mine. And so one day I get up, I go to get ready and leave for a class and for work, and it's a little cold outside. So I go to this hall closet that we have to get a jacket. I open it up, and as soon as I open the closet door, there is this snake on the floor staring up at me. So I lose my mind. I slam the door shut. My roommate was already gone for the day, so there's nothing I could do. I go get some towels out of the bathroom, and I kind of stuff them into the crease of the door. I go to our living room and get this poker table that doubled as like a dining table. I fold it up. I set that on top of the towels to weigh it down. I want to make sure that this snake does not leave that closet hiding somewhere in my house. So I run outside, I leave, I call my roommate, I'm like, Marco, listen, there's a snake in the house. I don't do snakes, so you got to do something about this. So he's like, don't worry, go to class and then go to work. We'll both get home tonight around the same time and I'll take care of it. So later on that night, get home, we both pull up, we go inside. I'm kind of in the living room, far away watching, standing on a couch, terrified. He goes to the closet, he moves the poker table, he moves the towels, and he opens the closet door. He looks around, he's like, John, I don't see a snake in here. And I'm like, no, man, I promise you, there was a snake in that closet. You better find it. So he gets in, he starts moving stuff around, he's looking, he's like, dude, I'm telling you, there is not a snake in this closet. As he continues looking, he sees we've got these little kind of fold-out chairs, those kind you would take to a tailgate. They have the little carrying bag with them. And the bags that you carry the chairs in have these little black straps on them, and those bags are sitting on the floor. So he's like, hey, I think what happened is it was early. You hadn't had any coffee yet. You opened the door. You saw these little black straps. They kind of look like a snake if you just glance, and you freaked out and shut the door before you could realize there wasn't a snake. So I go up, and I look. I'm like, okay. Yeah, those straps, they do kind of, if you just glance, that looks like a snake sitting on the floor. So I'm like, okay, good, I'm feeling a lot better. So 2 days later, it's Saturday. I wake up, I open my bedroom door, and the first thing I see is the back half of a snake chilling in the hallway, and just the back half was like 125 feet long, and it was like this big around. All right, or at least that's how it felt in the moment. So I panic. I let out this blood-curdling scream. I'm like, snake! And Marco comes running. He's like, what's going on? He comes around the corner, and he sees, he's like, oh, there's a snake in our apartment. I'm like, I know there is. I told you that 2 days ago, and you didn't believe me. So he goes and he gets this 30-pound replica of the Excalibur sword that, the legendary King Arthur had. He goes and grabs this replica sword. Now, you're probably wondering, as a side note, why did you have a 30-pound replica of the Excalibur sword? And I don't know, it's college. So, you've got weird odds and ends. It seemed like a good idea. So he grabs this replica sword. He goes and he grabs a stolen stop sign off of the wall that our previous roommate had, and he uses that as a shield to go to battle against this snake. And I'm not lying. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in my life, because this snake, it's hiding under a couch now, and it's lunging and striking at the stop sign. It was absolutely terrifying. But finally, he's able to pin it down with the stop sign, and he uses Excalibur, and he takes this thing out. And it was literally one of the most terrifying things I have ever experienced. I hate snakes. I can't do snakes. A snake being in my home is literally the worst nightmare I could have. All right, now, we've all got things like that, right? Things that terrify us, things that we think about, man, if I am ever confronted with this, that would be like my worst nightmare coming true. Now, the reality is we've all got those kind of phobia type fears, right? Like mine is snakes. For some of you, maybe spiders, maybe heights, it may be speaking in public. We all have those kind of fears. But the reality is that those kind of fears don't usually keep us up at night, do they? But there's other kinds of fears. There's another kind of fear that gets into our hearts and takes root deep in our souls. And these kind of fears wreak havoc at night. Maybe it's the fear of losing a loved one, or the fear of not being able to provide for our families. Maybe it's the fear of our children walking away from the faith that we hold so dear. Right? We all have these things that are deep inside that we fear, that we're afraid of, anxiety, and these things. But here's what we're going to see in Revelation chapter 2. We're going to see through the words of Jesus to this church is that all of those fears are valid fears. Right? Those deep fears we have, they are very real fears. But what we're going to see through the words of Jesus is that Jesus' plan for our lives is not to go through life paralyzed and crippled by these fears. So this is what Jesus says, Revelation 2, verse 8. He says, "Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, the one who was dead but is now alive. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those who are opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what He is saying to the churches. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death." So in this series, if you're new with us, we are looking at this message that Jesus sends to these 7 churches who were in what is now modern-day Turkey. And there's typically a pattern with the message that Jesus sends to these churches, and the pattern is that Jesus first introduces Himself, and then He commends them for something that they are doing well, but then He essentially rebukes them for something they're not doing well and something that they need to correct, something they need to work on. It's interesting, the church in Smyrna is one of the only 2 churches out of all 7 that there is nothing that Jesus rebukes about them. There is nothing that Jesus sees that causes Him to stop and pause and say, guys, you're in trouble because of this. You need to work on this. You need to turn this around. writing to this church was specifically to encourage them. That's why he writes to the church in Smyrna, solely to encourage this church. And specifically to encourage them not to be afraid. Now, as we begin and talk about fear, anxiety, and how we deal with that, we all deal with fear, right? We all deal with anxiety, but the reality is that scientifically, some of us deal with that much more than others. Right? What scientists have discovered is that there's a certain gene that we all have. It's called the SLC684 gene. I'm not smart enough to know that. I just looked it up. But there's this gene that we all have. And what scientists say is that if you are born with a shorter version of that gene, you are genetically predisposed to overwhelming fear and anxiety. All right, now, how many of you, when I say that, you are now anxious and afraid that you were born with that shorter version of the gene? Right? If that's you, you probably were. Okay, if you're worried about it, you probably were. And to be honest with you, I think I was born with a shorter version of that gene. Let me grab this. Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right. No, I think this genetic predisposition to fear and anxiety, and I think I've got that too, because you can ask my wife. Like, I stress out, I worry, I fear the most ridiculous things. Like, I'm the dad who before bed, I've got to go around, check all the locks 10 times, jiggle the handles. I've got to go put my hand on all 4 kids' chests, make sure they're still breathing. Like, I am an anxious and fearful person. Okay, and some of you are like that. You can relate to that. But here's the deal. Whether or not we may have more of a genetic predisposition to fear and anxiety, God's plan for our lives is that we would not go through life crippled by fear and anxiety. And so to understand how that's possible, to understand how we can go through life without being paralyzed by fear, well, we need to understand what this church in the first century was afraid of. See, if you look again at verse 9, Jesus tells them, he says, I know the blasphemy of those who are opposing you, and they say they're Jews, but they're not, but they belong to the synagogue of Satan. That's a pretty crazy statement, right? And then he goes on in verse 10, and he says, hey, some of you, you're about to be thrown in prison, and some of you are going to be facing death. So here's what's going on for this church. If you've been here the last couple weeks, you'll remember we talked about how in this time in history, within the Roman Empire, the emperor is worshipped as a god. This is what was called the imperial cult. To be a Roman citizen, to live freely in the Roman Empire, you had to worship the emperor as a god. Now, in Rome, there was a little bit of religious freedom. You were free to worship whatever other gods you wanted to worship. You could worship whoever you wanted to worship, as long as you worshiped the emperor and the empire above all of those other gods. All right, so that was law, essentially, in the Roman Empire. But there was one religious group that the Romans made an exception for, and that was the Jews. So early on, when Rome took over, they realized that the Jews were very strict monotheists who only worshiped Yahweh, and they realized that no matter how they threatened them, they weren't going to get the Jews to worship Caesar above Yahweh. So the Romans were faced with this choice. They said, okay, well, we can either literally throw in prison or kill every Jew in the entire world, or we can make an exception for them. So they chose to make an exception for the Jewish people. They said, okay, well, you don't have to worship the emperor. You can continue worshiping Yahweh as long as you never claim there is any Lord or king other than Caesar. They said, if you want to worship Yahweh, that's great, but you must not claim allegiance to any Lord or king other than Caesar. By the way, as an interesting side note, that kind of gives some context as to why the Romans, when Jesus is crucified, the sign they put on the cross was King of the Jews. And so they said, okay, you can worship whoever you want if you're Jewish, as long as you declare Caesar as Lord and King. So during this time after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the majority of the first Christians were Jewish. Right? They were Jewish, and they believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of their Jewish faith. They believed that Jesus was the one who all of their Old Testament prophets had prophesied about. So they began to worship Jesus as Lord and King. They began to worship Jesus as God. And as they did that, they still practiced their Jewish faith. They still saw themselves as a Jewish people. So they would still go to synagogue. They would still read the Hebrew Scriptures. They would still participate in all of the Jewish festivals and celebrations. They were just adding on, worshiping Jesus as Lord and King onto that. So when these first Christians began to claim that Jesus was king, the leaders of their synagogue started to get really nervous. Right? Because if Rome got word that there were these people in the synagogue who were saying Caesar's not king, Jesus is king, then the Romans were going to come in and shut the whole thing down. And so the leaders of this synagogue in Smyrna, what they did is any of the Christians who confessed that Jesus was Lord, they began to kick them out of the synagogue. They began to socially ostracize them. They began to blaspheme about them, as Jesus says. So here is what the people in this city were facing. As new Christians who had been kicked out of their Jewish synagogues because of their faith in Jesus, they are no longer covered under that exception that was made for the Jewish people. They were no longer free to worship the one true God. They now had to make the choice, will Caesar have our allegiance, or will Jesus have our allegiance? And if they chose that Jesus had their allegiance, then Rome is going to come in and arrest them and kill them. Right? That is literally what the people in this church are facing. And in the middle of that, in the middle of those circumstances, Jesus writes to them and he says, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be scared. But here's what's so interesting. Jesus doesn't say, hey, don't be afraid, don't worry about it, it's all going to be all right, it's all going to work out. He doesn't do that. Now, if my kids are afraid, that's how I kind of try to make them not scared. Right? Like if they come in one night, they're like, oh, I had a bad dream that a monster came into my room. I'm like, hey, don't worry about it. Monsters aren't real. You're totally fine. Don't be afraid. Go back to sleep. Right? If I want them not to be scared, I try to show them how irrational their fears are. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't say, hey, don't be afraid. It's all going to work out. You have nothing to worry about. No, instead, he says, hey, don't be afraid even though you're about to go to prison. Right? He says, don't be afraid even though some of you are about to be martyred for your faith. He says, no, it's going to get hard. It's going to be very difficult. The days in front of you are going to be much harder than the days behind you. But Jesus says, in spite of that, don't be afraid. Jesus is telling them that there is a way, that it is possible that somehow we can face our greatest fears without being crippled and paralyzed by those fears. So if you're taking notes, here's kind of the big idea, the big takeaway that I want us to take home with us and remember today. What we are seeing here in this passage through the words of Jesus is that our greatest fears are always opportunities to build greater faith. Right? Whatever your greatest fear is, right? That fear that is deep in your soul, that fear that keeps you up at night. If you look straight into that fear and face it, that is an opportunity for you to build a greater faith in God. Back in October of 2019, I kind of discovered what my greatest fear was, and I was faced with my greatest fear. So long story short, I got pneumonia. My doctor gave me some antibiotics, but the antibiotics didn't work, so the pneumonia kind of lingered for several weeks. So I was going back in for a follow-up. He was doing, an x-ray to check out my lung, and by this time, my lung had basically collapsed. So he's like, all right, I'm calling the hospital. I'm going to admit you. You need to go to the hospital right now and, do whatever they tell you. So go to the hospital. They do some scans, go back to the room. A few minutes later, a surgeon comes in. He's like, hey, here's the deal. The pneumonia has turned into this nasty infection in your lungs. It's not going to go away with medication or antibiotics. The only way it's going to go away is if we surgically go in and remove the infection. So I'm like, all right, well, that stinks, but cool. So, what's the deal? How does this work? Do I, go home, take it easy for it and come back in a week or two? He's like, no, they're prepping the OR for us right now. I'm like, oh, this is fantastic, right? A lot of time to really prepare for this. And so in that moment, again, I'm a worrywart. I have fear. I have anxiety. I deal with all that. So I start thinking, my mind starts racing. I'm like, okay, I've got this infection. The antibiotics aren't clearing it up. So if they don't get all of the infection out, then the infection is eventually going to start to spread. It's going to get into my blood. And once that happens, like, I'm done. It's over. There's no coming back from that. And here's what I can honestly say. In that moment when I'm thinking about all of these scenarios and I'm in a situation for the first time that, like, this situation could literally cause me to die, I can honestly say that I realized that I wasn't worried at all about what would happen to me if I died. It was actually, in a weird way, a blessing to be able to go through this, because through going through that, it proved to me that my faith was real. Right? It proved to me, hey, like, all this stuff I say and think, like, I really do believe this, because I wasn't worried about what would happen to me. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, if I died, I was going to be with Jesus. I was going to be good. I was going to live again. In that moment, I wasn't worried about what would happen to me if I died. But I realized my greatest fear was worrying about what would happen to my family if I died. Right? I could not stop thinking about how Christy would have to raise our 4 kids by herself. I could not get rid of the anxiety of thinking about my kids growing up in this difficult, tough world without their dad. I couldn't not think about Zion, our youngest, who was still a baby at the time, growing up without any memory of his father. I realized that my greatest, my deepest fear was not being able to be there for my family. But again, I can honestly say that it was in that season, it was through facing that fear that my faith in God grew more than it has during any other time in my life. And it was because in the midst of that fear, what I realized is that as much as I loved my wife, I realized that God loves her infinitely more. And as much as I loved and cared about my kids and wanted to provide for them, God loves them and cares about them and will provide for them infinitely more than I ever could. And you see, I realized that if something were to happen to me, would it be incredibly hard on them? Absolutely. But God loved them, and it would be okay, and they would make it because God would be with them. See, what grew my faith in the face of my greatest fear was not somebody saying, hey, don't worry about it, John, you're going to be fine. It's all going to be good in a few days. That's not what relieved my fear. What relieved my fear was the realization that God was greater than that fear. That God was so much better, that He was more powerful than that fear. So whatever your greatest fear is, again, that fear that is deep in your soul that keeps you up at night, whatever it is, the way that you fight that, the way you go through life without that crippling you and paralyzing you is by looking to God. And by the way, we look to God by looking to Jesus because Jesus is the perfect revelation of God. It's by looking to Jesus and seeing Him in all of His glory. That's how we fight our fears. That's what He calls the church in Smyrna to here. Again, they're being confronted by this fear. And Jesus' solution for them is not to say, guys, don't worry, it's going to be okay. No, Jesus' solution is to say, no, it's going to be difficult. But don't focus on that. Focus on me because I'm greater than your fear. See, notice back in verse 8 how He introduces Himself in this passage. He says, I am the one who was dead but is now alive. That's how he introduces himself to the church. I am the one who was dead, but is now alive. And he does that because their greatest fear was death. Their greatest fear was martyrdom. And Jesus is saying, hey, that's a real fear. That is a valid fear. He says, for some of you, that fear is going to be coming true. But he's saying to them, when I am the object of your fear and not death, then you can move forward. Then you can walk in confidence and not be paralyzed. See, when we live the kind of life where our life is first marked by a fear of God and who He is, right? When we first fear God, that's when we learn that we don't have anything else to fear. There's this story that many of you will be familiar with in the Gospels where we see an example of this in action. In Mark chapter 4, what's going on is one day Jesus and his disciples, they've been out. It's been a long day. Jesus has been teaching the crowd. So at the end of the day, it's dark. They get in a boat to head back across this sea to go to a different region. And this is what it says in Mark chapter 4, verse 37. It says, they got in the boat, but soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. So the boat begins to fill with water. They're in the middle of the sea, in the middle of this great storm. This is a life or death situation. Verse 38 says, but Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown? When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, Silence, be still. And suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, Why were you afraid? Do you have no faith? So again, they're out in the middle of the sea. This great storm comes. The boat is filling with water, and they are going to drown out there in the middle of the sea. But they wake Jesus up, and that same voice that spoke the universe into existence simply speaks, and like that, the storm is stilled, and they are safe. But then look at verse 41, what it says. The very next verse. It says, Then the disciples were absolutely terrified. So during the storm, they were afraid. But after the storm, they're absolutely terrified. Who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. So again, when they're facing the storm, they're afraid. They're scared. But when they see Jesus calm the storm with his words, then they are terrified. And they are terrified because they begin to realize they're not in the presence of any mere human being. They finally begin to realize who Jesus really is. And so they move from fearing the storm to now they fear Jesus. And since they fear Jesus, they no longer have to worry about and fear the storm. See, when we experience Jesus for who he really is, when we see Jesus for who he really is, the first and the last, as he says there in verse 9, that he is the eternal God of creation. When we see that he is the one who is dead but is alive again. When we see Jesus in all of his glory, in all of his holiness, in all of his majesty, when we see that Jesus is our creator, there is no human response that we can muster other than fear. If we truly see Jesus, if we truly understand who he is, we don't have to fake an emotion. We don't have to muster up fear. The only way we can respond to seeing Jesus for who he is by fear. Right? This is what we see all throughout the Bible. So think about the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament. When he is given that vision of the throne of God, what does he do? He says, Woe is me, I am a dead man. He thought that simply by being in God's presence, he couldn't live any longer. Think about Peter, James, and John when they see the transfiguration of Jesus. When there for that moment, Jesus removes the humanity that he temporarily put on, and he reveals himself in his full glory and divinity. When Peter, James, and John see Jesus in his full glory, it says they didn't know what to say because they were terrified. They had walked with Jesus every day for years, but when they saw him in all his glory, They didn't even know what to say because they were terrified. I remember a couple of weeks ago we saw that John here in Revelation 1, when he sees this revelation, when he sees this vision of Jesus, he said, I fell at his feet as if I were a dead man. Right? When we realize the depths of our sin, and we are confronted with the holiness and the righteousness and the majesty of Jesus, there is no natural response that we have other than fear. We can't respond in any other way. But when we see God for who He is, and we first have that fear of God, but then we discover that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God doesn't call us enemy, but He calls us child and friend. And then He commands us to not be afraid. When we first see God in all of His glory, but we are made His children by the death and resurrection of Jesus, we realize that now there is nothing else in this world that we have to fear. So again, what is your greatest fear? What is that thing that is keeping you up at night? What is that thing that is causing all of that anxiety in your heart? Whatever it is, look to Jesus and see Jesus for all His glory. Because whatever your greatest fear is, Jesus is greater than that fear. Right? If your fear is sickness and your health failing and death, look to Jesus. Because He says He was the one who was dead, but He is now alive forevermore. And because of that, so will you. Right? If your greatest fear is not being able to provide for your family, look to Jesus. The Bible says that He's Jehovah Jireh. He is the Lord who provides for His children. Right? If your fear is not being able to find a spouse, or your fear is losing a spouse and being alone for the rest of your life, look to Jesus. He is Emmanuel. He is the God who is with us, the God who will never leave us or forsake us. Whatever your greatest fear is this morning, look to Jesus, because He is greater than our fears. Let me pray for us.